Okay, finally, we're going to look at deprogramming, leaving a cult. Okay, here we go. I read here, the only way I know to affect a deprogramming, these three are the ways. One, striking right to the heart of the point of vulnerability in a completely different and a more healthy way. The second is the introduction of a severe shock, i.e., the death of a family member, potentially, that creates too much dissonance against the cult doctrines to bear. And three, finding an emotionally intolerable contradiction inside of the cult doctrine. None of that is easy. In fact, it's all usually very difficult, as highly evolved cult doctrines have fixed these incongruities sufficiently to prevent the cultist from even seeing them. That is, every objection and contradiction has a kind of resolution within the cult doctrine. Though best, number one, almost never works except in therapy. Number two, has to induce three or it won't happen. So cult deprogramming, there's not much to say because it is hard and usually so deeply personal and individual that general prescriptions, as it were, do not apply. One thing that can be said in general is that cult deprogramming almost always proceeds from an initial doubt that spirals out of control, getting the cultists to start questioning everything they were taught within the cult in something of an avalanche, as it were, of angry skepticism. The deprogramming ex-cultist or apostate, if you will then usually become very angry at the cult and vent that anger at it for an extended period of time. That is sometimes called throwing rocks at the cathedral, as it were. And these will be the cult's most vicious and ruthless critics. Still, regarding the third case, wokeness in specific has a few gaping holes in it, which this kind of observation sometimes occurs. One that sometimes works within wokeness is that the abysmal treatment of women and homosexuals under fundamentalist Islam is both intolerable and absolutely defended at the same time. Under different, incompatible aspects of the same theory. Feminism is completely opposed to these abuses, of course, at a profound moral level, but post-colonial and critical race theory approaches, they utterly prevent criticizing the moral standards of a predominantly non-white, non-Western culture. Usually the accusations of racism and colonialism win out and prevent any criticism over the systemic and institutional abuses of women, because generally speaking, racism and colonialism are seen in wokeness as more harmful. Nevertheless, the contradiction is there, and it sometimes crosses their eyes, as it were, and gets them to start asking questions. Drawing this out for people only works on a small fraction, however. This also can work by exposing ways the cult's doctrine harms its charges in general. For example, woke cult doctrine speaks over and for minority voices and often arranges failing systems that hurt them the most. So we've recently been introduced to the idea that being racially black and being politically black are very different things, and have seen the struggle sessions initiated against racially black people who are not correctly politically black. And though people haven't generally known this about the woke cult, this limiting and inherently political take on identity is a central pillar of woke cult doctrine. We've also seen devastation in communities that mostly served black and other minority races and also disabled people in the social justice riots of 2020. Still, Case 3 can be very hard to induce. It often follows from the shock of a tragedy as described in the second case. Obviously, these events cannot be manufactured or discussed into being, though they do happen. Not much can be said about them here, but the author has seen them happen a few times with genuine religious cultists whose parents or children died in a sudden accident, for example, which is very upsetting, obviously. Their thoughts rapidly shifted to God is supposed to be everywhere, but he wasn't there that day, and the whole architecture unraveled quite rapidly whilst they grieved. I'll say even less about the first case, because although this sometimes happens in interpersonal interventions, it usually happens in the context of professional therapy settings and is beyond the scope of what's reasonable to comment upon here. Although it is worth mentioning that the woke cult is not this responsible. They explicitly use techniques and concepts stolen from clinical therapeutic settings in uncontrolled mass settings like classrooms, workshops, and mass media, mass broadcast, and they let amateurs, not adequately trained professionals, do this. This is consistent with the cult programming endeavor, though, because it allows an attempted evocation of the right kind of vulnerability in many people at once. And the ones who show outward signs of it can then be followed up with individually and properly then indoctrinated. This happens on college campuses, universities, as a matter of officially encouraged procedure, including classrooms. And finally, leaving a cult. If someone begins to deprogram from a cult, it's very important that they are welcomed and not shamed for their past participation in it, no matter how bad it was, how cruel they were under its programming. If you understand that they got there in the first place because of an incredibly inflamed point of vulnerability and were then psychologically abused into accepting the cult doctrine above all else, it makes sense why they would have been so hostile. In a practical sense, however, at the point where they first start to break free, they will still have very low trust for outsiders due to their reprogramming, and will still see the world largely as they were programmed to see it. Hostility back at them can push them back into the cult or into a different cult that promises to manage that vulnerability for them. And thus we have former wokesters that go then completely, to the other end of the spectrum. So in general, what we need is to help people leave the cult and avoid radicalizing in any other direction as they leave. It does none of us any good to turn rabid anti-racists into, open racists. Obviously, there's a very broad, very sane middle way that holds all the moral high ground and the keys to a properly better future in society. And it's our job to invite people to see it that way. We don't want to scare them off. To summarize then, wokeness is a cult for sure. And I'm going to do a further video on the, what do I want to call it? The obvious symbols, the symbolism and the symbols and the criteria for basically that. I think it's almost a religion. It's definitely cultish. So it's a cult, and it might even be a proper religion at this point, with a describable and a fanatic cult element within it, and protected by the relative reasonability of the broader faith. So anti-racism in particular, under its auspices, is explicitly framed religiously and with clear patterns of cult initiation. And that is what we're up against. So yeah, that's that. Just to remind you, that was from Dr. James Lindsay. He's an American-born author, a mathematician, and a political commentator. and he's written various books. I can drop a link into the description box. So yeah, I'm going to continue in this vein shortly, as it were, by looking at some of the characteristics of wokeness and how Christians are converting, unfortunately or unknowingly, to this cult. So watch this space, and I will see you soon. God bless. Bye-bye.